Hi folks. So in the last video, I was introducing the so-called pre-Socratics, which, as I explained, is around about 200 years of ancient Greek thought. And we saw there that we only have fragments to rely on. And the main preoccupation is trying to set out a theory of nature. So we have the basic elemental theories, the different elements being seen as primary, fire and water, earth and air. And we also see, particularly in the second half of this period, a growing sense of a sort of metaphysical dualism between change and stability and appearance and reality. So we'll see all of those themes recur in what we might call post-Socratic philosophy. So the philosophy that comes after Socrates. But this all begs the question, well, why is Socrates the name that separates this earlier period from what many would consider to be philosophy proper, right? So the philosophy that we readily recognize. And that's a difficult question to answer, particularly given the fact that, as I mentioned in the earlier video, we don't have a single piece of writing from Socrates. We have accounts of Socrates, but we don't have anything firsthand from Socrates. So in some ways, in many ways, it's very surprising that Socrates is this watershed thinker. Some of the answer, perhaps the key part of the answer, has to do with what we know about Socrates' life, or perhaps more pertinently, Socrates' death. As again, I mentioned briefly in the previous video, Athens and its allies were involved in a very long, protracted war with Sparta and its allies. And this essentially went on for a generation in the last quarter of the 5th century BCE. And at the end of this period, it had been punctuated with a period of so-called oligarchy. There was an oligarchy of 40. One of the characters in that oligarchy was Plato's uncle, so Socrates, most famous student Plato, his uncle. There'd been a lot of turmoil, essentially a situation of civil war, if you like, within the city. And as you could imagine, a civil war situation tends to create factions. I mean, civil war is factionalism within one nation. In this case, these are city-states. The ancient world doesn't know nation states in the way that we know them. Nation states are a relatively recent invention of the last 200 odd years. When we're talking about this ancient Greek world, we're talking about so-called city-states, and Athens is the city in question for us. So citizenship, belonging, is something that relates to the individual city, whether it be Athens or Sparta or Corinth. That's the allegiance, that's the civic identity. That's where the civic identity of an individual comes from. Now, Athens was renowned for its cultural, artistic, and philosophical, we might say, when we say philosophical, we might say scientific culture. That becomes even more the case in the 4th century BCE, when both Plato and then later in the century, Aristotle found schools. But Athens was known also before that, in the 5th century BC, for its dramatists, for its playwrights. And Sophocles, Aristophanes, Aeschylus before that. And underpinning this whole sense of culture for the Greeks were the epic poems of Homer. And the third element in the sort of cultural self-awareness of Greek city-states were the lawmakers. So the people who originally laid down the laws of the city-state. These were the cultural authorities for the ancient Greeks. So, you know, if you were lucky enough to be educated and you were a child of a well-heeled citizen, aristocratic citizen of a place like Athens, then you would be, at least the boys would be educated. And a lot of their education would be dominated by learning by rote the great epic poems of Homer, and also the poems of Hesiod and others. So these were the figures, the lawmakers, the poets, the playwrights. These were the figures that, in a sense, distilled the wisdom and the pride and the sense of identity of the ancient citizens, the citizens of these ancient city-states. Now, it would appear that Socrates, as a historical character, offended enough people by the time he was headed for 70 years old, that there was a sufficient appetite to condemn him. We know this both from Xenophon and from Plato's account. The earliest, the so-called early Socratic dialogues of Plato are centered on the last days of Socrates. So the period up to his trial, the trial itself, Socrates' defense, his condemnation, his imprisonment, and his death. And there is something of akin to almost the death of Christ in this story. And that, I think, explains the significance of Socrates as a figure. Clearly, in some senses, Plato spent the rest of his life, he would have been a young man, he would have been in his late 20s when Socrates was put to death, and presumably he'd been a follower of Socrates for some time before that. And clearly Socrates had a following, and some of his followers were quite rich and quite influential. Plato certainly qualify as one of such people. So what was the role of Socrates? What were his teachings? And why did he have such a following? And equally, why did the Athenian citizenry ultimately decide to condemn him? To say a little bit about what the little that we know about Socrates' background, and we get this information through elements in the dialogues. I mean, that's where we look essentially, because we don't have anything from Socrates directly. So, as far as we know, Socrates was certainly a citizen, but he didn't come from the kind of well-heeled aristocratic background that Plato came from. As far as we know, his father was a mason, so he was a kind of master builder, if you like. And his mother was a midwife, which we're going to suppose is a perfectly respectable occupation for a woman at the time. But, you know, she wasn't a cultural figure. She wasn't a poet or something of this description, that was a possibility to some degree in the ancient Greek world, although it's limited. Certainly, ancient Greek society is certainly patriarchal in every significant sense. So Socrates comes from what you might call a kind of humble middle class background, if we use contemporary terminology for this. So that's one thing. Socrates doesn't come from what we might call the ruling class. So that's something somewhat subversive, right? Sort of a relatively lowly character. We know that Socrates did serve in the military, but then all citizenry in ancient Greek cities would serve in the military. But certainly based on Plato's account and Xenophon's account, Socrates was pretty exemplary in terms of one of the great Greek virtues, namely temperance, which is sort of self-control, essentially. Socrates seems to be a character, as we see in dialogues like Symposium, for example, who is, happy to drink wine, happy to attend a party, but never loses self-control, is able to enjoy wine, enjoy company, and enjoy music to a point, but remain very in control of himself, very self-reflective. Socrates also seems, in terms of the way he's depicted, a fairly ascetic character, by which I mean not craving pleasures of the flesh, as it were. Again, there's some mixed messages around this. Again, in the Symposium, there's a lot of sort of teasing conversation about Socrates and Alcibiades, this sort of young, brilliant man, Socratic man, and the idea that there's an erotic attraction between the younger man and the older man. Homosexuality is culturally accepted practice in ancient Greece. In some ways, it's sexuality between men is considered to be more dignified than sexuality between men and women. The latter is seen as more sort of functional and procreative in a sense, whereas male to male sexuality is seen as more, in a sense, recreational and therefore dignified. But also there's the theme of the older, wiser man and the younger, beautiful man. That theme comes out very strongly in the Symposium. And certainly historical depictions of Socrates don't depict him on the whole as a particularly attractive man. He's described as snub-nosed, probably balding. The depiction that you're seeing right now on the screen is from a famous painting of the School of Athens. And it's of a particular period where essentially everybody looks very buff and well turned out and muscular and handsome. So the image here makes Socrates look pretty dashing and certainly in good shape. But that's a certain idealization in this case. Certainly from what we can see from the dialogues, what Socrates had to offer was not primarily his good looks, but rather his insights and his ability to see things in a clear way. Now, so much for the man and his background. What do we know about what he taught, what his philosophy was? Well, here's where it gets tougher. Here's a quote from Xenophon, rather than Plato, and Xenophon tends to write in a more direct, down-to-earth, matter-of-fact way relative to Plato. Plato's much more given to kind of poetic flourishes and so forth. But the quote from Xenophon, "The man who persuades you to lend him money or goods and then keeps them is without doubt a rogue. such as just a question of, in a sense, everyday justice, giving back what's owed. But much the greatest rogue of all is the man who has gulled or fooled his city into the belief that he is fit to direct it. Again, we have to take any such statement with a pinch of salt. We don't have any verification or ways of verifying or corroborating anything that's attributed to Socrates by Xenophon or Plato. However, if you compare the two accounts, then you, particularly the early dialogues of Plato, you start to get a sense, you start to kind of picture it, put it together, right? As to what is likely the teaching of Socrates. And the issue that I draw attention to here is the idea of leadership, civic leadership, so the political leaders, essentially. And certainly fitness to rule is a preoccupation. By what virtue, by virtue of what, does somebody claim to lead socially, culturally, politically? This, I think it's fair to say, would have historically been a preoccupation of Socrates. And we can see already that this very question is highly sensitive. Traditional authorities presumably would not have appreciated somebody calling into question their legitimacy and their right to rule. Again, if we kind of zoom out for a minute, to understand the nature of ancient Greek society, the most esteemed and prestigious Athenians and Greeks in general would have claimed a sort of lineage going back through the generations, famous fathers and forefathers, and all the way to some mythic characters, some gods, demigods, and so forth. Now, of course, to us in the 21st century, that seems pretty fanciful, right? I mean, it's as though you kind of traced your ancestry back to, I don't know, one of the apostles or something, right? If you think of, if you have a religious worldview, right? So, we go back all through all the generations or something like this, right? And of course, having said that, there is a lot of contemporary interest in ancestry, and people find out that they're whatever the distant relative of some king or prince or something like that. So it's not as though even contemporary society has evolved beyond this sense that, well, I must be someone special because if we go back long enough, I find this, these aristocrats or these royal members of a royal family, right? So clearly we've not grown entirely beyond that idea that who I am and what I am and my status is defined by who my distant ancestors are. But in Greek society, that was a much more pressing thing. And then that's one thing. There's the aristocratic roots, if you like, going back through the family. And then there's the other elements of cultural political authority, which I mentioned earlier, the poets and the playwrights and so forth. And piecing things together from the early dialogues on in Plato, we can see that Socrates calls into question all of these authorities. And as a later thinker, the 19th century German thinker Nietzsche would point out, the great Socratic question is, how do you know what you know? And if you can't account for what you know, and in this case, if you can't show that you have superior knowledge, then you have no qualification to rule. And now this is a problem because if the sources of cultural and political authority are essentially ones of lineage on the one hand, and then received wisdom on the other. Um, these are not, as it were, you know, this is not neutral scientific grounds for claiming anything. Right? There would be a certain sensibility of a kind of right to rule, but there wouldn't necessarily be on an individual level the ability to say, well, you know, I've studied this and I've thought about this and I've meditated on this and I've come to these conclusions and this is why I feel I'm qualified to rule. And of course, there are other elements in play, namely, what were the attributes of a political leader that would have given them influence in society? And you know, the answer to that question is not significantly different to the kind of answer we'd be likely to give today, namely, you know, being a good speaker, being charismatic, being able to work with people well, to some extent, being able to flatter the public and appeal, you know, present an appealing picture of what they want their politicians to look like. And certainly in the Platonic dialogues, all of this comes into play, and particularly the ability to persuade is important. And this comes into many Platonic dialogues in terms of a opposition between, on the one hand, what's called sophistry. The sophists seem to have been itinerant speakers, almost if you like motivational speakers, who went from city to city, gathered students who paid them to be able to convince others, right? The skills of rhetoric, essentially. And in the Platonic dialogues, there's this continual effort to show, well, here's true knowledge on the one hand, or philosophy, the route to wisdom. And on the other hand, here's sophistry. And the sophistry is just really about convincing people of something. You're not worried about whether it's true or not. Your sole aim is to implant conviction. Whereas philosophy is presented as the sort of rigorous, impartial pursuit of truth. And what's interesting about the latter is that it doesn't actually matter whether anybody believes the truth. It's not measured. The truth isn't measured by how many people believe it. Whereas truth in the sophist type way that's exactly truth is what people for the most part believe. Right? You know, this is an epistemological problem that has gone on to be inquired into over the succeeding millennia, and we're still, you know, working on those kinds of problems. The relationship between belief and truth. You know, on the one hand, the psychology, if you like, of truth, and then is truth something unto itself? Right? To come back to Socrates. Ironically enough, Socrates was clearly a pretty charismatic character, and clearly he was able to, if not convince people, then at least get under people's skin. In one of the Platonic dialogues, we have this famous image of Socrates as a so-called gadfly. So, as I mentioned in the earlier video, a kind of biting fly, something that's goading you, right? Something that seems small and significant, but keeps on making you uncomfortable. And it's a very useful little image, because it gives a sense both of Socrates' seeming insignificance, right? I mean, you know, the image here is not being stampeded by elephants, like huge and powerful creatures, or devoured by a lion or something, right? Or being swooped upon by an eagle or something. I mean, the gadfly is a very humble and seemingly insignificant creature. And yet it keeps on coming back and disturbing you, right? Giving you the sharp, unpleasant sensations. And as an image then of Socrates, I think it does two things. On the one hand, there's this sense that Socrates does not loom large in people's mind. He seems like almost almost a sort of joker of a character, right? Sort of buffoon almost. Certainly a lowly creature, right? That isn't worthy of your attention. But at the same time, keeps on, pricking your conscience or whatever it is, right? Like the gadfly metaphorically is doing. Now, as in the cartoon here, was Socrates a social reformer? That's very hard to say. I mentioned in the earlier video that on balance, Socrates looks like a skeptical philosopher in the sense that he's not so much, and we have these kind of statements, right, in the early Socratic dialogues. It's not so much that Socrates wants to displace received wisdom with some other kind of more profound insights into the human condition or the cosmos in general. Socrates, a historical character, most likely eschewed that type of thing and actually preached more of a doctrine of, well, we can't actually know. Almost a kind of wise humility, if you like, right? Or a wise unknowing, right? That these things are not for the likes of us, and we human beings are severely limited in our capacity to truly understand things. But it does appear that the one thing that Socrates perhaps allows us to gain insight into is how to live well. So the moral questions perhaps are the ones that we should focus on. And certainly, again, that's a motif that comes up in Plato's early Socratic dialogues, that there's no point in speculating about the cosmos and the stars and the nature of number and the fundamental reality and all of that stuff. Certainly stuff that the so-called pre-Socratics are writing about. That actually we need to come down to earth and we need to ask ourselves, well, how do I live well? How do I be a good person? How do I exemplify those virtues? How do I come to know myself? How do I come to know my own limits? How do I come to serve my society and the people around me in the best way possible? These much more pragmatic, down to earth, moral questions. Those were, in all likelihood, the core of Socrates, the actual historical Socrates concern. But certainly Plato, his most famous student, ultimately took things in a different direction. Plato does become very speculative. Plato is clearly interested in all of what we subsequently see as the core branches of philosophy, including metaphysics, so speculation about the nature of ultimate reality. So if the early Socratic dialogues offer this very restrictive understanding of the pursuit of wisdom to do with essentially the first person question, what can I do well? Over his lifetime, Plato certainly expands the boundary of his inquiries and doesn't restrict himself to that very tightly circumscribed Socratic domain of philosophy. So I'm already talking about him, but with the final thinker that I'll talk about today in this video is Plato. Now, Plato in many ways was, and this is a depiction again from the School of Athens of Plato on the left, and actually Aristotle on the right. I'll explain some of the symbology of the representation in a moment, but to stay with Plato for now. So in many ways, Plato was sort of the opposite to Socrates, in the sense that Plato was very well connected, came from a very prestigious Athenian aristocratic family with an esteemed lineage. As I mentioned earlier, his uncle was part of the so-called the oligarchy, the so-called tyrants. Doesn't sound great. And certainly it was part of that turmoil at the end of the 5th century BC in Athens. And Plato was, by all accounts, predestined to become an influential political leader and politician in Athens, except something happened, and that something is called Socrates. Along with the turmoil, the political turmoil in Athens at the time. And, to what degree Plato completely gave up any aspiration to be a politician or a social leader is open to question. It's probably more accurate to say that Plato redirected his efforts to be socially effective and influential away from politics in a narrower sense to trying to influence the ideas and the sort of cultural atmosphere, if you like, of Athens, and focusing on the establishment of the academy, which was his school. It would have been presumably a private school, fee-paying school, and it would have attracted young men, not only from, possibly women, from obviously from Athens, but also from elsewhere. And we do have a series of letters that are ascribed to Plato. Scholars have pored over these letters for many centuries. Some of them are considered genuine, some of them are considered spurious and not genuine, and sort of forgeries, essentially, from later periods, even though, even as forgeries, they're interesting. But it seems likely from some of the more plausible letters, some of the more credible letters of Plato, that, for example, he undertook a series of trips to Sicily to work with a tyrant there, a sort of a leader, a monarch, if you will, to perhaps to realize something along the lines of the ideal city-state that Plato sketches out in his most famous work, Republic. So, putting the clues together, it's not as though Plato lived the life of a hermit as a consequence of the civil war in Greece and the death of his teacher Socrates. Quite to the contrary. Early on, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the early Platonic dialogues, the early so-called Socratic dialogues, not written by Socrates, of course, but by Plato, they do commemorate and bear witness to the death of his teacher. But Plato very quickly, or relatively quickly, expands out from that into epistemology, for example, in dialogues like Theaetetus, looks at the nature of truth, the relationship between truth and perception, and truth and belief. And by Republic, clearly has what seems to be a sort of full-blown metaphysic. One of the most important elements of which is, as we'll come to see in the following weeks in this class, the doctrine of knowledge through recollection, or anamnesis, as it's called, in unforgetting, as it's called, in the Greek word that Plato uses. And perhaps this doctrine of rebirth, which we already find in the early Socratic dialogues and may or may not have been something that Socrates believed, that our souls are reborn periodically. So, Plato in the so-called middle dialogues, the middle period of his life, of his working life, Plato is very quickly expanding into much more speculative areas. And although he remains interested, certainly central preoccupation is still how do I live well? The moral questions, the questions of knowledge, epistemology, and the questions of reality, metaphysics, ontology, are equally in play for Plato. And those two other areas of epistemology and ontology underpin, arguably, the moral teachings of Plato. Now, to come back briefly to this depiction in the School of Athens, the painting School of Athens, Plato and Aristotle are depicted at the center of the school for obvious reasons. At this point, from what we know, Aristotle came to, I'll talk about Aristotle in the next video, but Aristotle was not an Athenian. He came from Thrace and came from Abdera, from Macedonia, and which was a separate domain, separate kingdom, and so forth. But came to Plato probably around the age of 20. And Plato would have been considerably older than him at that point in time. And the depiction here is Plato pointing up to the heavens, that the heavenly principle, the invisible, if you like, the unchanging is the key thing. And Aristotle has this sort of gesture of no, we need to possibly, that's the body language. That's one way of reading it. We need to keep our feet on the ground. That Aristotle is sort of depicted as this more down to earth, nature-based thinker. And certainly what we know of Aristotle, he spent a lot of time observing nature, plants and animals, cataloging them. And when he goes on to found his own school, we can see that in the people that take over the Lyceum, which is his school. Plato's school is the Academy. Aristotle's school is the Lyceum. The subsequent leaders of Aristotle's school, the Lyceum, are very focused on study of nature. So that's part of the sort of symbology of the painting here, trying to communicate. Now, even if many of you have never actually read Plato before this class and reading the excerpts from the Anas anthology, you'll probably have at least heard of, if not discussed, possibly in a formal learning context, Plato's allegory of the cave. Now, I'm just going to touch on this. We'll come back to Plato's metaphysics and look at it in more detail in future classes, future weeks rather, and future videos. But for now, just briefly to use this as a sort of shorthand for a sense of how Plato goes from these relatively humble questions of, how should I live? What do I owe other people? And so forth, the Socratic questions. This is something that we find, this image, there's a series of images that lead up to this. And the allegory is a sort of composite of sort of different analogies, essentially. The allegory is a story, a metaphorical rather story, right? That has many moving parts, and so it's very suggestive and very effective way of conveying something. But note that Plato is using essentially a literary device, a fictional device, to tell us something about the nature of reality. There's something profoundly important in that, right? Something that I'll come back to in future videos. But to describe the way the allegory works, the allegory is a kind of narrative. So we can see down here in the bottom left a series of people that are depicted as imprisoned. They're shackled, unable to move. They are able to speak, so they're not gagged in any way. They can talk among each other. You have to go with the with the analogy in the sense that you don't say, well, how do they eat and how do they go to the bathroom and stuff like this, right? Just, well, okay. I mean, it's an image. You have to run with it, right? It's a thought experiment, if you will, right? So you put all those subsidiary questions to one side and try to understand the logic of the allegory itself. So we have these characters shackled facing a cave wall. The idea that they're sort of underground is itself very powerful. And so they're unable to look behind them, which is important because Plato says that up on a sort of parapet of some kind of wall, there are other free individuals that are holding up models of certain things, persons, objects, animals, and that behind them is a light source, a fire, and that therefore shadows are cast on the cave walls of these various cutouts, these various models. And then behind these folks is a kind of pathway which leads to a doorway out of the cave. And once he's described this situation, Plato then says, well, imagine, if you will, that one of the prisoners is all of a sudden set free. Now, again, you have to go with the image. Plato doesn't tell you why this person is released. He just tells you that they're released. Now, I should add one more detail before I get to the next step, which is that the prisoners talk about and speculate about what they're seeing. And they try to, predict what figure is going to show next and why this one is next to this one. And essentially, that's their theory of reality, right? Their speculations about these cave shadows. Right? Anyway, so one person is released and they make their way up and out through the entrance to the cave. And at first, Plato says, understandably, the sunlight is much too unbearable for them because all they've ever been used to is the darkness of the cave, the relative darkness of the cave, and the firelight, etc. So they get diffuse sunlight as they come out. They actually see the sunlight streaming in through the cave entrance. And then when they get outside, it's even more blinding. And so they have to kind of cover their eyes and look away from the sun and so forth. But they do make their way onto the surface of the earth, and then they start to see this amazing world of plants and animals and so forth. And the apex, the climax of the ascent is when the released individual is able to, briefly look at the sun. And the allegory as a whole is meant to depict someone's emerging from ignorance and darkness into knowledge and light. And this person who has been released from the cave has only ever known up until this point everything that they've seen in the cave and everything that they've talked about in relation to these cave images. And what this person sees is that, well, these were all just models. These were static images, but these real things exist outside. The trees and the creatures and so forth, the clouds, all of this actually exists. And these were just copies that they had taken for reality. So filled with this sense of revelation, but also with a sense of responsibility, and that's an important element in the story and the allegory. This released individual then decides to come back into the cave and enlighten the other prisoners. So they make their way back in and down, and they confront the prisoners with what they now know to be the truth, which is that they, the prisoners, are seeing mere models of reality, but not true reality. And the only thing that the prisoners know, and the only standard that the prisoners have for ascertaining truth is, well, what do people know about these? So they expect the released prisoner who proclaims themselves to be enlightened to be able to say something cleverer about these images than anyone else among the imprisoned group. And of course, they can't, because they keep on saying, well, this isn't reality. This is not important to understand. For example, which shadow follows another shadow or whatever. They're just shadows. They're not important. They're not real. And so, unsurprisingly, the prisoners condemn him. Another element that Plato mentions is that there's two ways to feel confused and discombobulated. One is to go from extreme darkness into extreme light, but also to go from bright sunlight down back into the cave. So another reason why the released prisoner is not very convincing is that they're sort of stunned with the transition back into darkness. What the allegory seems to be telling us here is it's very hard for the wise to communicate their wisdom to the ignorant. That either everybody ascends, and then, in a sense, communication becomes unnecessary, or the enlightened one, in a sense, is burdened and isolated with their knowledge. They can't really convey it, or only with difficulty. And there's a certain self-reflexivity to this image, because, as I mentioned briefly earlier when I started to talk about the allegory is an image. So it's possible, certainly we get this in one of the Platonic letters, that ideally wisdom would be imparted directly, but it's not possible for the human mind mostly to be directly told the nature of reality. We need these images as step ladders, if you like, as a scaffold to get to truth. And later on, as the image famously goes, we can kick away the ladder, but we need that initially. So too, when the released person comes back into the cave, they're not able to directly communicate the truth. And there's this question, which is kind of, in a sense, the old Socratic skeptical question. Not so much now as to, can I actually know the nature of reality, but more, if I do know it, can I communicate it? Right? And this is an important question, which, again, it's a question that recurs in ancient philosophy. How do I communicate true knowledge? Which in a way is the question of teaching as well, in Greek, paideia. Is the quest for truth ultimately a solitary individual quest? Or can knowledge and truth be shared? And if so, can it be shared directly, or is it only sort of indirectly, right? So there's a whole sort of pedagogical theory here in play, which is, first of all, can knowledge be attained? And secondly, if it can, how does it get passed from one person to the next? And it's a whole bunch of fascinating questions around that. So the purpose of this was just to give you, to dip our toe into some Platonic philosophy. And one other element worth mentioning, a sort of final element that I'll mention, to do with Plato, is Plato's interest in mathematics, which for the Greeks is arithmetic and geometry. And in a later dialogue, the Timaeus, which in many ways is a very much a standout, remarkable dialogue, a later dialogue. So the early Socratic dialogues are Plato's early writings, probably in his 30s and 40s. The Republic is a middle dialogue, in Plato's middle age, and then Timaeus is a very different type of dialogue, which belongs to the late period. And Timaeus is essentially a cosmology. It's an origin story. Where did the cosmos come from? also seems almost like a kind of response and a going back, interestingly, to the materialist elements of the pre-Socratics, because Plato speculates again about the nature of the elements, but he even has a geometry of the elements, and that's what this illustration is depicting. You can see here, the four elements, right? Air, earth, fire, water. But now here, Plato is connecting number and shape to the elements, right? And you can see, I mean, it's almost an early sort of atomic structure type speculation, right? And then these are elements, and then you have the sort of the combination of all the elements. And early on in the Timaeus, there's a sort of theory of materiality, what Plato calls chora, right? The sort of the earthly, the sort of earth material element. And it's a very fascinating dialogue. As I say, it also has the image of the demiurge, demiurgos, which is kind of the handwork of God. This idea that, in a sense, the primal stage of the cosmos is unformed matter, and this creator God doesn't bring matter into being. Matter pre-exists, but forms matter, creates formal elements. So the creator God, if you will, the Timaeus, is sort of forming the earth, forming matter into these sort of perfect geometrical figures, creating the elements of the formed cosmos. So the form matter duality is something that Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, will pick up on and refine in his physics and in his metaphysics as well. But there's lots of speculation about the nature of number in the cosmos and so forth. So I just bring this in addition to show that where we began in this introduction and these two introductory videos, in a sense, we can end on that point, which is that these questions of materiality, the questions of the origin of the cosmos, the questions of how does the world around us come to be the way it is, these cosmological questions don't go away. They remain in play. But Plato in particular puts a lot of store in geometry and mathematics more generally being the high road to understanding the nature of the physical world. There's something, in a sense, beyond the visible, because you don't obviously see these geometrical structures directly with the eye. There's something that is, as it were, behind the physical world, in virtue of which we can explain the physical world. And that's an important element, certainly, of Plato's thinking. Just like in the cave allegory, the folks who are trapped in the cave, unless and until they get their way out of the cave and see things as they are in themselves, have no way of explaining ultimately what's going on. So this transition from what at first appears to us to what is truly real is the key transition in Plato. And that's both a metaphysical and an epistemological question. How do we, as it were, come from a position of ignorance into a position of truth? And again, with these types of questions and with this type of approach to philosophy, we have gone well beyond the confines of the Socratic question, how do I live well? So in the next video, I'll be getting into more detail on these questions, specifically the question of how do I live, but we'll see more sophisticated answers to these questions, both in ancient Greek philosophy, but also in ancient Roman philosophy. So the way that the Roman period philosophers both take up some of the themes and the motifs and the theories that they find in ancient Greek thinkers, but also develop them in different directions. So that will be our next video.